So I think it's time to talk about the certificate of immunity that everybody's been talking about. What is this thing they're talking about, this magical cure that we could reopen the country, every country in the world? So we're going to explain first the immune system, how the body defends against foreign objects, pathogens, shall we say. We'll talk about antibody testing, what exactly we're testing, and then we'll talk also about vaccination and some modern strategies. To start off, we'll talk about the immune system. So we talk about the body as having two different types of immune system. We learned in school that the biggest part of the immune system is the skin, right? You got to protect yourself if they can't get in, right? Well, they can't get in then. Wonderful. So there's, first of all, what we call the innate immune system. And then the opposite, or the other counterpart, is called the adaptive immune system. The innate immune system is what we use to fight off things in general. These are sort of your foot soldiers in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Not the smartest, but you got a lot of them, and they kill some stuff. They react first. They're quick. And they're not very specific for sort of what they attack. They just attack something that's not yourself. How do they tell? Well, we think certain bacteria have sort of elements that are all similar. For example, formylated methionine instead of regular methionine. Our body, for an amino acid, uses regular methionine at the beginning. Bacteria use formylated methionine. If it's formylated, obviously it's not us. Kill it. Otherwise, you could think of bacteria. They have cell walls. We classify bacteria into gram-positive and gram-negative. And so gram-negative have lipopolysaccharides and gram-positive have teichoic acid. That's another easy way to tell. And there's other cells as well that are different, right? Like fungus have different walls, quote, than bacteria. So they react, they attack, and they sort of call this inflammatory response, where they sort of have a lot of collateral damage, but they get the bacteria to explode as well, right? There's also phagocytosis, where actually they eat the bacteria or the pathogen. And then there's the adaptive response, which is what everybody's talking about. The problem is the innate response, you sort of got it, you sort of don't. There's not much we could do about it, right? Some people have a wonderful innate response, and some people don't. But we can't change that, so why bother talking about it further? The adaptive response is where we think we could actually do something to help those people who have issues. The adaptive response is where all these letters come in, T and B. They're called lymphocytes. And so there's B cells and there's T cells. So B is known as humoral. They make antibodies. And T cells are called cell-mediated, and they're cytotoxic. There's T helper cells, which we know from HIV. And this is our adaptive response. This is the part that has memory, where when they see it, they'll say, I've seen you before. The innate response, they won't remember you. You could come in again. They're like, oh, new person. The adaptive response, they'll remember, like, oh, I've seen you before. They're ready for you. They can ramp up pretty quickly. So what is this talk about protective antibodies? I mean, aren't all antibodies protective? Well, it's a little bit complicated, right? Antibodies sort of are just a general term, right? So antigen is something that is an antibody. So it's basically the same word. It's just sort of the opposite sides of the word. Antigen means antibody generator. So it's sort of, they define each other. But anyways, antigen, antibody, they match, they attach to each other. That's all it is. And usually when we say antigen, we mean sort of things that are the spiky points you see poking out of this, what coronavirus looks like. So those are antigens. We're trying to get our body to recognize those so they could fight the coronavirus when it comes in the future, whether you've seen it or not. Practically speaking, when we talk about protection right now, there is no such thing as protection. China has some programs to say whether or not you're safe. They give you a little green sort of thing on your phone. It doesn't actually say whether you're immune. They haven't tested your immunity, and we don't even know, frankly, how to test immunity right now. But the idea is they sort of say your risk level, right? Where you've been, what people you come in contact to. Oh, this person just tested positive for coronavirus. Oh, you've been in contact, thus you're not green anymore. Well, so the US is talking about this certificate immunity, right? And I think the basic thing is sort of what do they mean by that, right? How certain are they that somebody is immune? Or do you mean somebody doesn't have it, right? That's a different thing. So many times they want to say somebody is immune, and I don't know how long it's going to take us to get there. I think it's very complicated with all this data coming out on how, some people aren't developing great antibody response and they've gotten the coronavirus. What else could you want for a vaccine? Well, I think the thing is, let's talk just briefly about the idea of not having it, right? That's something we can test for right now. We have methods. Our method's not 100%, right? There's false negatives, meaning they swabbed you and you don't have it, but you actually have it. Dr. Lee, the doctor who ended up dying, who was one of the first people to sort of shout an alarm about this, he was tested multiple times and they said he didn't have it. Well, he did, and he died from it. But when you say protection, right, you also have to talk about measuring protection. Because if you think about it, so let's say we talk about castles in the Middle Ages. So let's say you say, my castle is very well protected. I have a wall and I have lots of archers inside. And I have lots of knights inside as well. Well, if a king comes with an even bigger army, are you still protected? Oh, well, So actually, we have to sort of measure something to see whether people are protected. And measurement brings in a whole another set of issues. So the WHO has a very nice article. I put the link at the bottom because I actually don't really know how to, do these things, like how to put in a screenshot. But if you look at the article I linked, look on page 7, there's a diagram at the bottom. And I'm using this diagram to illustrate how complicated it is. So on the left you have vaccine, and you have protection on the right. Don't worry about exposure or clinical endpoint, that's a little bit too complicated. But you have IM10 and IM11. What do they mean? They mean that the vaccine creates something called IM11, let's say an antibody that's protective, and it gives you protection. Wonderful. It also creates something called IM10. It's not exactly protection, but it's related to protection because if the vaccine worked, it created both of these. And thus, you don't have to actually measure IM11. You can measure IM10, and you'll be good as well. So if you think about it this way, so if you're going from the left, right, from vaccine to protection, right, you got to cross a river. There's a few ways of crossing a river. Let's say we only have a bridge, right? You could cross the bridge right here. You could cross the bridge right here, But presuming you're reaching the same sort of destination, it doesn't really matter, right? Or you could have to have multiple bridges to cross the river, because you actually have to have multiple steps. There's maybe an island in the middle and then another river. Actually, the Bay Bridge in the Bay Area is like that. You have a sort of treasure island in the middle. So, it gets quite complicated, right? So what are we measuring here? How do we measure this? What level is protective? These are all very, very difficult questions. So first of all, the question is, if we're measuring antibodies, what are the antibodies against? There's no such thing as the virus. The virus has many, many different parts. The body is very specific. It doesn't attack the virus. Just think about it. You're a little tiny particle. You can't see very well. You can't see the whole thing. You can't put it together, right? Let's say we're tiny and we're looking, at a very big thing like Earth. We can only see trees. We can see this or that. We can't say Earth, right? Can't see it like we're seeing it from outer space. We can't recognize Earth. We have to use little bits here and there to recognize. So the body has to sort of recognize something, and we're talking about little parts. epitopes, whatever term you want to use, but little spikes that they show you on those pictures, right? So against which spike though? There's many spikes. That's the first question. And the second question is, what if there's lots of antibodies? And what if it changes over time? What does that mean? So I'm not going to talk about it much, but let's look at hepatitis B, because it's very complicated, as I mentioned before. So again, I put the links at the bottom because I don't know how to put it in. But if you look at the CDC handout for interpretation of hepatitis B serologic results, you see how there's so many different antibodies. There's anti-hepatitis B core, that's HBC, anti-hepatitis B surface, that's HBS, right? And there's IgM, you see later, right? I guess they didn't list, E and other stuff like that. But there's a lot of stuff, and if you look at the next one from Wikipedia, it's just a graph. It shows you over time how these levels of antibodies that we make change. Wow, that's pretty complicated, right? And here they show anti-HBE for E antigen. So what do we do? How do we figure all these things out, right? I don't know. Somebody's going to have to figure it out, right? And it's going to take us a while. And then let's say we have figured it out. Let's go back and talk about immunity. So, how long is this immunity good for, right? That's a very good question. We know nothing lasts in this world, right? Nothing's certain except for death and taxes, right? Your immunity may not be certain as well. Well, does immunity wane? Of course it does. We know that. For many vaccinations. For many things we're, quote, immune to. How long until it's not good enough? Well, it depends. Hepatitis B definitely wanes. I mean, sometimes people get a booster. Rubella doesn't seem to wane. Maybe once you remember rubella, what it looks like, you'll remember forever. Does a low level, because waning, we mean the level gets lower and lower when we test for it, does it mean you're not protected? Well, that's a difficult question. You definitely don't have a lot of antibodies, but you have cells that should remember what this thing looked like, and they can ramp up pretty quickly, right? So maybe you are protected? Is immunity absolute? Well, of course not. Nothing's absolute. You should have known this by now, not even having listened to my talk. So let's say you got the vaccine for pneumonia, and you say, now you can't give me pneumonia. I'm like, really? Are you sure about that? Let me just keep pouring that bacteria into your lungs. You're going to get overwhelmed. When we do tests, we do it in controlled settings. And that's one issue with, say, antibiotics. We say, this antibiotic works. Well, no, it may not work. It depends on how much bacteria there is that it has to fight. If there's too much bacteria, it may be wonderful, but it can't take on an unlimited supply of bacteria. And so I think in the best example I have is something called an abscess. It can't get there. Antibiotic works, but it can't get there. There's just too much stuff. It's like if you have a big collection of bacteria all in there, and antibiotics coming from outside, from the blood supply, trying to get inside, it can't actually penetrate. There's just too much stuff there. Another problem is mutation. So HIV is well known for having mutated. That's why we find it so hard. Influenza mutates all the time, and that's why we also find it so hard. So yeah, maybe your antibody is wonderful, but yeah, that was a last year's model. You might want to upgrade. Another question, can you tell immunity by blood testing? Oh, that's more of a what we call translational medicine question. There's a lab test, and then there's how things actually work in real life. And it's a bit complicated, as we said, right? Because again, we have two types of immune responses. We have the innate one, right? And the adaptive one. We're talking about adaptive here, but the innate is definitely helpful. And what we think is a lot of these people who are younger, who don't have antibodies, but they clear the virus, their innate immune system must be good. And I think that's what we think. A lot of people who are younger have much more, quote, robust, stronger innate immune systems. What we also know is different people have different responses, right? That's just sort of obvious. So antibodies don't tell the whole story because there's still a person behind this. And person A may have a low level and person B may have a high level, but person B may end up getting it and person A may not. Because this is still only one way of clearing a virus, one way of defending. In fact, one very limited way. The only reason we're focusing on this way is this is something we could do something about, we think. The other stuff we sort of given up on. You're old, I mean, your immune system doesn't work well. Yeah, that's why we have antibodies for you, and we give it to you for pneumonia, for even a low suspicion pneumonia, because your immune system just doesn't work like it used to. But the thing is, other stuff we don't have much, so we're going to focus on what we can influence. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So we've already talked a lot, so I'll stop here for part 1 in talking about this certificate of immunity, and I explained sort of antibody testing thus far. And part 2, we will talk about vaccination.